Want to get ahead in digital-first content? The Drop is the go-to newsletter for industry professionals, delivering insider news, trends, and insights straight to your inbox. Navigate the fast-changing landscape of digital-first production, distribution, and monetization. Sign up now for free at dropmedia.co.uk and stay informed with The Drop. Hi, I'm Justin Crosby and welcome to a new season of TellyCast. This week, we're talking branded content with Charlie Reid, founder of Upstream. Charlie's a creative strategist and founder of Upstream, drawing on over a decade of experience in the independent agency world. Prior to launching Upstream, he co-founded The Outfit, a creative agency focused on turbocharging fast-growth businesses. He also set up Channel 4's in-house agency 4 Creative, where he married entertainment insights with effective brand storytelling expertise. He now uses that to bridge the gap between producers and brands in the branded content space. Charlie's worked with some of the world's biggest brands to help them navigate the content space, and he's here to share the 5 things every content producer needs to know about branded entertainment today. We're going to cut through the noise and give you a clear playbook for building stronger partnerships with brands. Charlie, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Very well, Justin. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Not at all. Great to have you on and great to be talking about branded content, branded entertainment, brand-funded programming. We're going to get into that in a minute in terms of what the right terminologies are. But first of all, tell us about Upstream then. Tell us about your business, because obviously you've got a really long career in branded entertainment and marketing and the whole creative space. So tell us about what it is you're doing right now.
Well, Upstream has predominantly been set up to really help production companies find and diversify their revenue streams into new areas, particularly we're working with brands. And the role of Upstream is really to help those businesses future-proof their offerings moving forward. But I think one of the key things that we do really well as a business is to help brands and production companies redesign really how we all work together so we can actually get some great business off the ground and make great work.
Yeah, well, it's a crucial time for that, I think. We had lots of conversation with producers over the last few months about obviously the lack of commissioning and the bigger role for brands now when it comes to entertainment, and amazing work with some brands are doing and where this space is all going. I think the one thing is for sure is brands are going to become more and more important, aren't they, in terms of entertainment providers. But so tell us about The Outfit as well, because The Outfit was a business that you ran for a number of years after Channel 4 that you recently sold as well. Tell us about that.
That's right. Well, I think going back to my time sort of at 4 Creative was predominantly an agency set up by Channel 4, clearly, to deal with marketing output, working across their channels and to advertise all the great programming on Channel 4, Film 4, E4 and More 4. But one of the key prerequisites of setting up that business was that it could work with external brands. And I oversaw sort of 60% of the revenue coming in working with brands in different ways. And what I really noticed, and this is 15 to 20 years ago, that brands were increasingly recognizing that there's an advertising job to do with traditional advertising, but there's a whole new market opening up where brands wanted to blur the boundaries between advertising and programming and get closer to an editorial space, do a job that advertising couldn't actually do and can't always do very well. And that really sort of led us down the path of really thinking about what a business, when we left Channel 4, would look like. And that was The Outfit. And predominantly the work which we really pioneered was in the branded entertainment space.
Right.
So we ran that for 15 years. And then we sold it last year to a social agency. But I was really also looking for the next big challenge from that sort of point. And you touched on it earlier, Justin. Production companies are going through a particularly hard time with seismic change in media. And I think with that inevitably comes huge opportunities. So having started out my career originally at production companies, I felt that it was time to go full circle and help production companies really navigate this new space of working more coherently with brands and interpreting the language of brands to be able to really open up new revenue streams for production companies.
Yeah, well, I think there are ways, and we're going to touch on this in a second, that there are ways that perhaps producers have treated brands, approached brands, thought of brands that probably isn't an approach that's fit for purpose in today's market. But we're going to talk about that in a little while. But coming back to something you just said about, brands wanting to get into that space that advertising couldn't reach. Can you expand on that a little bit? I mean, is that more about brands wanting more cultural currency and wanting to become more relevant? Because we all know, we all hate advertising, really, at the heart of it. We all try and skip ads. We all try and, just avoid ads when they're coming on. As a consumer, it's a necessary evil in many cases. But what is that space that brands are looking to approach?
Well, I think when we started out sort of discovering this space back at 4 Creative and also at the outfit, I think arguably we were a little bit ahead of our time. So first off, I think the brands which were experimenting with this space of actually figuring out that actually there could be, as you say, a different way of connecting with hard to reach audiences and do something outside of normal advertising, which would bring a story to life in a different way about the brand, which people often wouldn't know about. And you couldn't usually coherently do in a 30-second television ad. But yes, we were very much, I think, sort of kind of ahead of the time. I mean, there was a report in 2023 by Kantar where 87% of audiences, or maybe it's 83%, were saying that they actively avoid advertising. Not necessarily hate advertising, because there is, look at Gogglebox, we can see that there's a huge part of the populace who still see the ad break and it still does an amazing job. But I think we're definitely, as part of this seismic change, going through some seismic audience habit change, particularly as we know with our kids and with anybody under the age of 30, the way they're consuming media is different. And I think that advertising's found it harder to compete in that space across more platforms, across kind of different types of viewing habits. The fact that everyone's second screening and tuning out of ad breaks is a real problem. So I think there's a recognition now in the market for marketeers that actually, as part of a change, it's not just media in the broader sense with production companies and distributors being affected. Marketing departments are going through a seismic change as well. How do they get attention? How do they command attention in a really busy market? And it's a bit of a problem. Let's
talk about terminology then. Branded entertainment, brand-funded programming, advertiser-funded programming, branded content. What should we be calling it? What is the correct terminology in your view that accurately describes what we're talking about?
Really interesting point. Happy to be drawn into this discussion. I think in the broadest sense, clearly brand funding is a mechanism by which brands fund content. So that bit is absolutely fine. And that is a broad description, I'd say, which summarizes all of those touch points you just talked about. But I think if we look through the lens of a marketeer, branded content's been around for a long time. And often that terminology is sort of used by marketing teams to create product demos, editorial pieces about not necessarily the brand, but about the product. A lot of it is quite tactical. A lot of it is quite performance driven. And a lot of it, quite frankly, ends up in the bin. It does a very important role for the brand, but it sits at a different point within the marketing funnel.
It's not entertainment.
It's not entertainment, no. It does a certain job. And actually, if you step back and you look at a marketing funnel, and I'm going to bore people about marketing funnels, but it's a very important thing for production companies to understand. But in the old world, and it applies to the world we're in today, however, journeys are slightly different. But very literally, there's a marketing funnel where you have brand awareness work, which sits at the top of the funnel. And that's traditionally advertising and 30-second TV ads. You then have consideration, which is where you win consumers' hearts and minds. And then you have conversion, which is often the performance and tactical side of advertising. And a lot of branded content sits within that consideration and lower funnel activity. So to your point, I really like the word branded entertainment because, first of all, it plays to the strength of production companies and indies, what they do brilliantly. And entertainment is a thing which engages audiences. And that, when you insert that into our terminology, it puts it further up the value chain. And I think that's the really big thing about this market at the moment. Whilst there's plenty of room to do lower end tactical social work, I think the real unlock with production companies, indies, is getting them further upstream to the top of that funnel by creating work which genuinely engages audiences. And that's branded entertainment to me.
Yeah. Okay, great. And that's helpful. And I think, to your point as well, production companies really in the main, and obviously using this as a very broad brushstroke. I know there's some production companies out there who are really well versed in doing amazing work within branded programming, but I think there's also a number of other production companies who may be a little bit guilty of only approaching brands when they can't get a traditional broadcaster to fund a show. You know, it's like the brand is the last gap, fund. You know, the last port of call for funding before a project dies. You know, so we're going to be talking about, as you say, going upstream, understanding a little bit more about what brands need and how to talk a bit more of brand language and understand what they need. And really, this is a new customer for a production company.
Correct.
Production companies have had a broadcaster as as a customer for many, many years. That's kind of relationship has remained unchanged for 40 years or so. This is perhaps we're moving into a new area where we might need to understand a new customer from a producer's point of view. So let's go into these 5 different things that every content producer needs to know about brand-funded entertainment. So number 1, brands don't fund shows, they fund business outcomes. Unpack what that means for producers.
To your earlier point, Justin, about ad-funded programming, I think we lived in a blissful age 10 to 20 years ago where there was a very good revenue stream for certain types of production companies around getting brands to fund programming. But I think, as you said, that relationship was slightly flawed because at the end of the day, if we're being really honest, the commissioning editor wanted to make a program to fill their schedule and the production company wanted some additional revenue to top up their production budget or to fill a funding gap. And whilst that, from an economic perspective, was completely fair, it didn't work for brands. I interviewed marketeers over the last year and a half around their experience around ad-funded programming, and having done some of that stuff over the last 5 to 10 years, it's always been an uncomfortable relationship because from a brand perspective, it's advertising cash. And when it's advertising cash, it has to do something for the marketing department, for the brand. So when I talk about that sort of top line statement you talked about, it's about reframing how production companies talk to brands and how they start thinking about what's actually important to brands, because it's not that they want to make programming. They don't wake up in the morning and go, I'd love to create something on ITV. They wake up and they need to either sell something or they need to do something which enhances brand reputation. There's a different set of return on investment, ROI, and business objectives.
They've got a job to do, basically.
They've got a job to do, exactly. And when you start understanding that, and actually, I think you've talked about in previous podcasts, the brands of the new commissioning editors, I think it's about understanding what was right for commissioning editors needs a reframe for what's right for brands. So understanding that language is increasingly important. And when you do that, brands are more open to business, and that we do need to get these relationships working closer together.
And how do producers understand that? How do they approach that mindset shift? Because it is a crucial mindset shift, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And for some people, it's really alien. And I think, to be honest, some of the stuff which Upstream's doing at the moment is taking people on that journey. It's really about getting into the terminology of, again, I think I was saying earlier, what's important to brands and understanding that, and shifting what's important to a commissioner is what's important to a brand. I think understanding sectors which you might operate in. So, for example, let's say you make work which is to do with cars or is in a specialist sort of area. I think there's some common synergy to brands automatically and the type of output that you make. So I think sometimes I find the job number 1 is to sit down with producers and to think about the environment they operate in. Where does their programming show up? What type of advertisers are around them? What are they really about? What are they actually doing? What's in their shows? What's the content? And I think when you start looking at it through the lens of brand, that's when other opportunities open up. But there's no doubt there's a bit of a guiding hand to do within this to understand, get the unlock right for production companies of actually how do they start talking in the language that a marketer will understand.
So a good starting point might be for, as you say, if there's a production company who makes a lot of car shows or shows in the automotive sector, then it's obviously not a massive leap for them to understand and to start to approach car businesses and related businesses and related industries as maybe their target brands that they want to work with, and then understanding what the marketeer's job is for those brands, whether it's Castrol GTX or whether it's I don't know, Tesla, all their marketeers have got jobs to do, right? And it's about producer understanding what it is they want to do. Is it a brand? Is it about the model in particular? Is it about a benefit of that particular product that the company might want to emphasize?
Yeah. And also just a bit overarching, it's really about solving business problems. That's what it's really about. But to your point, you need to understand what those problems are. If you really look at the advertising sector, there's an awful lot of insight and knowledge out there, which is freely available. There's annual reports, which often talk about brands and what's happening in their sectors, what their threats are, what their problems are. So you can actually, with a lot of research and applying what production companies are really good at, is actually figure out what's important to brands. And some of that is, again, just about reframing what you do against how you can solve a business problem for a brand.
Right,
I think one of the things for me, Justin, actually is the word production company is quite an interesting use of terminology, because unfortunately, from a brand perspective, it implies that you're at the end of the supply chain, that you're executional rather than sort of helping brands solve strategic problems. And actually, I think some of the job production companies need to do is reframe themselves as audience businesses, because what they do understand is how to create great content which connects with audiences. And that is what brands are trying to do. It's actually the similarity between them two. They both want to connect with audiences with engaging content.
This is interesting, actually, because traditionally brands have had maybe a media agency, and they may have an advertising agency or an executional agency as well. So those strategic conversations might happen with not necessarily all of those agencies around the table. It might just actually come to an agency and then they're set up to execute that. But we're talking about a TV production company or content production company having a seat at the table at a strategic level. And yeah, obviously that needs research, and that needs a company to emphasize their expertise, as you say, within more audience and understanding how to communicate through the medium of visual content, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of agencies in a client mix. And I think one of the things which is going on brand side at the moment is this huge disruption in how agencies actually work with their brands. You can see the articles happening in the trade press about the problems WP and Dentsu are having at the moment. And they own big agencies and media agencies. There's a lot of disruption going on that side. Now, what that means is that brands are now looking at basically how they hire services to fix business problems for themselves. And that disruption, absolutely to your point, is an opportunity for those buying behaviors of old to change. And I think part of it are there will be production companies who will be able to go direct to brands increasingly. A lot of brands are now taking agency services in-house. So 4Creative was an example of that. That was 25 years ago. But the whole reason why Channel 4 wanted to bring agency services in-house was because they wanted it quicker, better, and cheaper. So brands are taking control of their own agency services now. There's something like 80% of brands have some sort of in-house agency now, whether it's PR, social, or full creative services. There's different degrees of it all. But what that means is you've got different access points as a production company to get into brands. Going to brands is one route. I think the other route is also just getting better at how you talk about your ideas in the context of working with media agencies, also PR agencies and social agencies. If you turn up not just with an idea, but you're really clear about the problem it solves for brands, you basically are just going to move your idea on further up that value chain, because it's not about the idea, it's about solving a business problem for a brand. So I think either way you do it, I think part of this is production companies understanding that reframing how they sell their ideas will just mean more opportunities longer term.
Do you think that with social video, the advent of social video and brands becoming more able and much easier and quicker for brands to be able to tell stories direct to their audience rather than having a broadcaster as a gatekeeper, surely that brings more opportunity for production companies, because there's going to be more content that brands can afford to produce, because they're not paying exorbitant advertising fees. They can actually just build their own audience by creating their own content. So surely there's going to be more content needed to be created.
Oh, 100%. I think that I was talking to a CMO a couple of months ago, and he was saying, I think traditional advertising thinks that there's inevitably sort of 4 or 5 television ads you might make over a period of a year. Now, that might be with a large retailer on the high street who has various sort of marketing cycles and beats within their sort of business, which they need to hit, whether it's summer, Easter, autumn, and Christmas. Now, within the context of below that, to your point about content, there's an estimated 2,000 to 2,500 other assets on top, which brands now need to make to fill their funnel. And we haven't even talked about technology and AI getting in amongst that as well. But there is a volume of assets. But we also are fully aware of things like AI slop, which I think is a fantastic terminology to use out there. And it's all very well that we can turn out more and more of this stuff. But going back to the brand problem, they still need to create work which connects. I think the opportunity for production companies is going back to your AFP model, whereas there's tendency then just to make the program, is to now think about content ecosystems, which you can build out around the IP. And that is really interesting because then you can create something which might do a brand job at the core of the marketing strategy. And that's doing a brand awareness job from the brand. But then around that, you build a world of all that other content which a brand needs. And if you can connect it all the way to the bottom of the funnel, that is an amazing revenue opportunity for production companies. And I think they could also create work which works because there's a lot of agencies within that ecosystem for brands, and they have various sort of specialisms, and it's often not joined up. But if we can create a world where entertainment fuels that entire funnel, then that gets quite exciting.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Well, it's great to hear about exciting opportunities for producers. Let's go on to your second point, which is producers already know audiences better than most brands. Tell us about that. How can producers use that knowledge as a leverage to help brands solve their problems?
I think the starting point of this, Justin, is that most production companies get out of bed in the morning and they have a pretty good idea what they want to make. So at the core of their business, core of their DNA is a genre which they really understand. And they've probably been doing it for some years. It's built within their DNA. They know how to make programming for a certain space, and they're known by broadcasters, by commissioning editors to do a certain type of content really well. Extrapolating that out into the audience bit, I think what production companies haven't really thought about moving forward is actually where does our work often show up? And back to my earlier point about who advertises around that, which brands are buying around that space, because then you start knowing the audience window which you're in. So you understand that you're making work which always appears in a peak time slot on Channel 4 or ITV. You need to go a little bit further to really understand, well, what brands are buying around that space and what's that audience which Channel 4 or ITV have at that time slot. And that starts enabling you to reframe you as an audience business. It allows you to start thinking about, well, the work which we do appeals to this type of demographic. So we do this type of content. It appeals to this type of demographic, and we've been doing it for years and years. Now, that's really exciting from a marketing perspective because marketers often don't know their audience, and they certainly don't know the types of content which is going to connect with those people. So as a production company, if you know the type of content that people want to watch, you also know how to make it. That's a very powerful tool. So part of this is really about unlocking that increasingly and being able to frame that actually production companies do a very valuable job, because actually, whilst they might not necessarily be a content creator and own an audience, they understand an audience. And that's really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, some of this might feel a little bit foreign to a traditional TV producer, though, right? Because their relationship to this point has been a purely a B2B relationship with a commissioner client, and the commissioner, they deliver the show and that's it. And they wait to see the overnights when they come out, however much further later, and then they find out whether they get a commission or not. They've never really been encouraged to understand that audience necessarily. They might know how to make it an amazing show and to connect with audiences, but they probably maybe don't have the in-depth audience intelligence that they might need. So how can they quickly get that intelligence? Because I think you said, a lot of it's out there anyway. You mean ChatGPT can pull amazing stuff from across the internet, right? So, what's the quickest way for a producer to tool themselves up with audience insights?
I would ask the commissioning editor to introduce them to the sales team or the broadcaster who they spend a lot of time with, because that's where the insight is.
Right.
Sales teams have this data. Scheduling teams have this data. It's all, certainly if you look at broadcast, it's already available. That's how a broadcaster makes money. Yeah. They have data and audience insight, and that's what they're selling to brands. So it's just starting, I think, to have different types of conversations with commissioners, with broadcasters, and start actually caring about this insight. That's one side. I think the other side is if your work, for example, moves into social, and that might be that the broadcaster do all of the marketing and do all the socials, or you might, as a production company, if you do it as a production company, clearly you can start getting some insight around what's appealing to audiences. There's social listening tools, there's data and insights you can gather from your socials. But even from a broadcast perspective, you can still start asking for some of that data and asking for some of that insight. So whichever way you do it, there's plenty of tools out there in third-party sense which you can access, be able to get insights around, who's talking about your show in social, for example. And there's also stuff sitting inside broadcasters, which I think production companies could ask a little bit more sort of in a specific manner, but understand a bit more about what's happening with their show and who's engaging with it.
Yeah.
Some production companies get it and some people don't, but broadcasters do hand this information out, and certainly
are they happy to share that? The sales teams, do you think?
I think you ask it in the right way. Why do you want to sort of understand? But I think if you built a relationship with commissioning editor, there's no doubt that they would set up a conversation with sales teams. Yeah. But sales teams as well are freely accessible. If you take partnership teams inside Channel 4 and ITV, they talk to production companies all the time. So it's not an alien relationship to have. I think they quite like the idea of talking to a production company. So I think it's about looking at your network and using the relationships a bit more to actually start pulling this information in, but also using third-party tools and also going out there on social and just seeing who's engaging with your content, and start thinking about how you can demonstrate how your work connects with a certain type of audience. There's a build from this, Justin, clearly, and this is where there is an expense involved with production companies, where you can bring in creative strategists through businesses like ourselves and other third-party businesses who can help make that intellectual argument by using a range of different data sources out there. But it is accessible. Some of it's paid and some of it can be free for your network.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's move on to number 3. Start with a brand's problem and build IP together. Tell us about that.
Well, I think it goes a little bit back to kind of AFP. There is definitely a model for AFP still moving forward. You've got a great idea, you've got a slot, and a broadcaster can help you via a media agency access brands. But it's a very complicated route. It's slow. Deals increasingly, I hear, fall down often. There's politics in the middle.
Yeah, that's the one thing that I find a bit frustrating with this whole sector, because you have a media agency and you have a person within the media agency who's got the brand as a client, and they may have an ulterior motive of why they want a particular production company to bring them into place, and then there's so many moving parts on the brand side, getting things signed off. Yeah.
There's a lack of control, and I think that
there's a lot of friction, isn't there?
There's a lot of friction, and some production companies, I think, sort of weigh up the balance, because I think there's a feeling that working with brands is incredibly complicated. Now, when I've looked under the hood on this various times, sometimes that's because there's a complex relationship there. Often the media agency team, whilst there's some brilliant media agencies out there, they often are still building a new relationship with the brand. They don't necessarily understand them. It's the ad agency who are usually the custodian of the brand and really understand them. But media agencies can sometimes be at sort of arm's reach. So as a production company, you're down here at the sort of bottom supply chain, sort of waiting for stuff to happen. And I think it's a really uneasy environment to be in, particularly when you're really dependent on a show landing in that quarter or for that year. But I'm hearing increasingly that the time to make this stuff is just can go on and on and on. And to your point about politics, suddenly it can be off, or suddenly the funding's been reduced. So part of this is actually looking at the model differently. And back to the earlier point about brands and business objectives, there is a different model out there where you really start with the brand at the heart of what you're doing. And you start creating a brief based around what the brand wants. That's a much easier environment to create great work. Now, that's not having to sacrifice creative integrity and that's certainly not about then making an ad, but it's about balancing the needs of the brand and starting there to understand their strategy. That inevitably means that when you're creating an idea, even if you then go to a commissioning editor and you're getting them to find a slot, you started with a brand problem at the heart of what you're doing. And that means that you've just got more parties aligned early on in the process. And that really, I feel, is the model moving forward.
But you really have to be asked, you have to be invited in, don't you, at that point? You have to be invited to the table to get close to that brand and to solve that brand problem. You need to be invited in by one of these key gatekeepers in this relationship, whether it's the media agency or the advertising agency or the brand themselves.
Yeah.
And that's first base, isn't it? It's how do you get to that point?
It is first base, but I think back to one of the earlier things I was mentioning earlier, with the rise of in-housing happening brand side, there's more accessibility to reach brands now, and that might be through the PR team, the social team. It isn't always necessarily through the marketing team. But I think what production companies also need to do alongside this is market themselves differently. So we all know that a lot of production companies look and sound the same. They have great content which separates them. But if I was a marketeer looking in, all production companies look like they do the same thing. Where's the point of difference? Where's their unique value proposition? All the stuff which brands really care about. I don't understand it as a marketeer. So there is a job here for production companies to do to start marketing to brands. Position themselves for these conversations. If you do it in the right way and you get yourself out on LinkedIn and you do good B2B marketing, those benefits will yield over time. To your point, if you just wait for someone else to come to you, you can do that, but you'll be waiting a long time. Yeah. So I think part of this is businesses starting to learn how to market themselves to brands and make themselves look available, and talk about some of the areas which we're talking about now in an eloquent fashion. Brands are open for business. They don't quite know how to talk to production companies, but if you help them, you're going to make that door just open a bit more.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. So coming about talking about conversations. Number 4, we've got brands talk a different language than TV and production. Where are those translation gaps?
What are we trying to achieve? Because from a marketing perspective, we are talking about metrics, and this is what you need to understand as a production company. What are the metrics which are important to brands? Is this about an awareness job? Is this about a reputation piece? Is this about a new product launch? Is this about actually we are needing to change behavior around our product because the younger audiences don't engage with it, or we appeal to an older audience, but we need to reach younger audiences. So really it's about positioning the work which you do, the treatments you put on the table, the ideas, about explaining, and I'm not talking about in a heavy-handed way, but starting to use the language of business results and what this will do. Now, it does feel very complicated from a production company perspective. But again, once you start researching brands and you start to understand the types of brands who are right for your content, you'll start to understand what's important to them. And it's just about reframing how you put ideas on the table. It's just not starting with, here's an idea, would you like to buy it? Because the brand will go, lovely idea, but what's it going to do? Yeah. I want to know as a brand, this will allow me to reach Gen Z. This will allow me to reach millennials. Why will it allow it to do us? Because we make content, 50% of our content connects with this audience week in, week out, and we really understand this audience. We can co-create something together which will engage and connect with the audience, which your advertising can't do. So it's just, I've used reframing a reasonable amount, but it's just looking through the lens differently and going, look, if I want a brand involved with this, I need to kind of get on board with the fact that brands need slightly different terminology at the table. There's still an idea, there's still a treatment, there's still production. All of that is normal. But to get it over the line and to get brands involved at the beginning, you've really got to think about what business job it's going to do.
Yeah. Okay. And number 5, from interruption to engagement.
So in the industry at the moment, and I was talking about that reference, that Kantar report earlier, there is a problem in advertising in the sense that people aren't engaging with advertising like they used to. And we can see some signs over the last 2 to 3 years that various brands are understanding that buying reach, which is using media money to buy advertising space, is actually becoming less and less effective. And it's getting incredibly expensive. You buy these eyeballs and then the content you're creating doesn't connect with the audience. So it's becoming very expensive. Engagement is something which has been really moving forward very quickly with brands over the last few years. And I think it really started in sport and fandoms. And I think people can understand now that people are congregating around big tentpole moments. And to be fair to entertainment, X Factor, big Saturday night shows, Ant and Dec, we've always had those tentpole moments in television and fandoms, but we haven't really necessarily made the most of it all. But brands are starting to realize that being in these environments and creating work which engages audiences, build audiences, is actually probably going to be the marketing model of the future. And you can see some of the signs out there. Foot Asylum, which I know you've referenced a few times on the show, is a really good example of that. Foot Asylum is a really clever model in the market where I talk about TV to the till quite a lot. And what they've done is created great content with content creators. They've put it in a really accessible space in the digital environment to be able to engage with. And you can buy a set of sneakers really easily. And that is actually incredibly clever as a business model, because traditionally we've offered linear TV and eventually someone has to buy something across a number of different steps and eventually get to it all. So actually YouTube allows you to decompress with great entertainment, something which happens in the sales funnel. Yeah. I'd also reference Dish by Waitrose. I think they're doing a fantastic job there. M&S as well. So admittedly, these are quite big brands at the moment who are starting to join it up. But obviously, Waitrose developed Dish, which is a standalone but a branded IP. They're now moving it into, they did the content ecosystems I talked about earlier. They're talking about, podcast. It's obviously on TV now. They're moving into events. There's a number of different areas which Waitrose can move. And that is doing an incredibly good job for the brand. And along that journey, of course, there's meal card and recipes, and you walk into a Waitrose and there you go, as seen on sort of TV or seen on YouTube. But this is where it's going. And I think that brands are realizing that actually they need to invest in intellectual property, which enables them to communicate with audiences differently. And I think this is only going to accelerate increasingly over the next few years.
Yeah. And obviously social video gives, the environment for brands to talk directly to those consumers as well and their customers and understand them as well, which they haven't really had up to this point. Absolutely.
And I think also as well, I think the traditional way of marketing is often shouting out and very salesy, and I'm kind of trying to buy eyeballs, in an advertising space. In social and on YouTube, we can build a relationship, and actually holding on to a customer is so much more important. Acquiring them is one thing, but holding on to them is the next thing. And I think brands realize that advertising is often you're churning through eyeballs. You're getting people to engage with you once or buy something, and then you let them go. And I think this is the kind of language of what I learned in broadcast when I worked at Channel 4, is actually how do you, as a brand, start behaving like a media owner? Now, what I mean by that is start thinking about, as a brand, how do I attract audiences? How do I engage with them? And how do I keep them coming back and talking to me as a brand and about as a brand? And I can see that, again, really moving forward quite quickly over the next few years.
Yeah, there's some amazing social work that's been done these days. Currys, I think, have really reinvented themselves through social recently, which is brilliant. But
exactly.
Lots of different examples we can give, obviously. Charlie, fantastic. Thank you so much for those 5 tips. It's been really, really useful. Gives us a different way to think about how production companies work with brands. And finally, one final question. We see Cannes Lion every year being, the big advertising industry event every June. Is it something that you think that production companies should maybe pay a bit more attention to? Because this is where the best work in the world is showcased every year. Is it worth, production companies not necessarily going to Lion and looking at, but, taking more of an interest in looking at all the award-winning work online that you can see there, do you think?
It's a hot debate, Justin, at the moment, because if you look at the advertising fraternity at the moment, they're realizing that to compete for these awards or take part in them is a very expensive business. So advertising agencies traditionally did it to get more work from brands and to have a bit of a sort of shop window. But it's also widely acknowledged that not many brands really think or really care about agencies winning awards. It doesn't mean that much to them. Now, the thing which does matter to them is about effectiveness. So things like the IPA, they have effectiveness awards. Thinkbox have planning awards. They're all predicated on business results. And those are the awards which brands want. So there's a big debate going on at the moment, certainly in commercial production company land, about entering work for Cannes Lion, because whilst Cannes is a wonderful place to go and it's lovely to win an award, does it actually yield business results for the costs you put in? Yeah. And that is a debate will be raging over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, it's going to be interesting. But you touched on AI and how that's going to completely change the advertising industry world. Yeah, it already is doing, and I can see that in the next year that just accelerating. But that might present some further opportunities for more traditional TV production companies within that mix.
Slightly controversially, but just to put it out there from a marketing sort of perspective, but actually, obviously, marketeers have all sorts of awards and all sorts of publications in their particular specialisms and in their sectors. And I think sometimes our industry more broadly, and I'm talking about advertising, I'm talking about production, I'm talking broadcast, it's a little bit of an echo chamber. We know the world we live in. But actually, when we start wanting to reach other audiences and build new connections, you need to play in their world. I often talk about, when I'm talking to not advertising agency, but when I'm talking to production companies about how they should market themselves, I think that rather than sort of turning up in broadcast or turning up in Campaign magazine, they should actually be advertising in The Grocer. The Grocer is the biggest retail publication which any marketer who's in retail reads. And if you want to advertise, that's where you go. It's an uncluttered market. Nobody advertises in there from the creative services space. That's where you'll get visibility and show up. So I think some of this is being clever when you start thinking about marketing yourselves, of again, understanding where marketers are and where you show up. So you can go to Marketing Society Awards where all the marketers are, spend time with marketers, be on their tables. They're incredibly accessible marketers. I think there's an industry we've built up which have all these layers. We need to peel that back. Certainly, I know that marketers want to talk to production companies increasingly, but we need to make it easier for them to connect by talking their language. And when we can meet together, that is going to be such an exciting time for this industry.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlie. That's fantastic. Well, now it's time for Story of the Week, where my guests get to highlight the TV industry news story that's caught their eye over the past 7 days. Charlie, what's your story of the week?
Right. Well, you put me on the spot. It had to be 7 days. Lots been going on in 7 days, and I've been away on holiday. Yeah. So, but what jumped out to me last week was a long read in Guardian newspapers around Netflix dumbing down the work which they make. It's an in-depth article. They talk to people who were in the commissioning side. They talk to production companies. They talk to senior execs who used to be at Netflix. Some people are slightly cagey about it all, but there's a recognition that as Netflix are chasing subscribers numbers, they're trying to make the work more and more vanilla so it can appeal to a wider set of audiences. And I think we all know that when we go onto Netflix and we go onto Amazon Prime, the watching is quite easy and the algorithm serves up more of the same type of work. And what we're missing now are the work which we fell in love with when we joined the TV industry 20, 25 years ago, work which connects in culture, work
but
which
you weren't expecting.
You weren't expecting, and you wouldn't know that you'd like. And I think this is going to be part of the AI problem, is that there's some great books out there about how AI is dumbing culture. And I'm hoping we're going to go through a renaissance in the next 5 to 10 years when people recognize that actually they're fed up with actually seeing umpteen rom-coms which all have the same storyline, all have the same cast, and basically there's nothing that exciting about them, all the same crime dramas. I think this is the point of where PSB can really come in. How can we find an economic model by which great work, which connects in culture and gets us to think differently about the content we consume. How do we get that into our watching habits? I don't know whether you got children, Justin, but certainly my children at the moment, I think we've gone through the last 5 to 8 years of social media and them just not liking and sitting still watching long form content. But I can see them coming back, actually. They're in their early 20s now. If you spend time with Samsung, the TV department, the biggest uptake of televisions in sitting rooms are 26, 27-year-olds.
Right.
And that's the biggest growth market. And actually, when you start to step back also in the industry and look at the Mr. Beast and Sidemen deals, their audience are also 26, 27-year-olds. And we know that YouTube is obviously in the living room. So there's a lot of big shifts kind of going on. And I think that Netflix will, whilst it has a market dominance in the moment, I think the areas it will start to struggle on is not having great content or different content, which can connect with micro audiences and culturally be relevant to, not the general populace.
The algorithm could start to work against it, maybe.
Hopefully so. Hopefully so.
Well, maybe a little bit of chink of light there for public service broadcasters. How about your hero of the week?
There was an article in The Drum. I don't know if you read it, but it featured an article by Andrew Friedman, who has set up an agency holding group, which is predicated on branded entertainment. And it's a fascinating article. He's actually had his business over the last 8 years. But like I was saying earlier on with the outfit, I think he felt that he was actually ahead of his time, but he can now see that CMOs are recognizing that they need better content, which earns attention. There's a recognition, again, that CMOs with their work, that it's not connecting with audiences. And Andrew has about 6 businesses under his holding group, and he is doing great things for the cause of branded entertainment. So everything which we're talking about today, Andrew's your guy. He's definitely my hero of the week.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll put a link in the episode description to that article and also your story of the week. And finally, who or what are you telling to get in the bin?
Well, it's not going to be a person, because that always goes down like goes down in the wrong way. So I'm going to put it back onto film. And as part of my re-education of my children around feature films and actually sit still, watch a film for an hour and a half, you'll get a lot out of it. I wanted them to watch Drive the other day with Ryan Gosling. And I had no idea. So I got beef with Netflix as well as the film Drive. But in 2011, I think that Zane Lowe remade the soundtrack. And so I paid, it was actually on Amazon rather than Netflix, but I paid £3.50 for the pleasure of watching this. And it had Zane Lowe's soundtrack. And it just killed the movie in every single way. And I thought that was a damn shame. So forget that. Zane Lowe's very talented, but leave the feature film soundtracks to one side.
Yeah, I love a good soundtrack. It can make a movie, right?
Exactly.
Or it can ruin one too.
Exactly. Yeah, it wasn't quite the same. Quite the same. And even my kids felt it as well.
Charlie, thank you again for joining us. It's been fascinating speaking to you, and all the best with Upstream and everything else that you're up to.
Thanks, Justin. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, that's about it for this week's TellyCast. Thanks to my guest, Charlie Reid from Upstream, for breaking down the 5 things content producers need to know about branded content. If you want to hear more conversations like this one, subscribe to TellyCast on your podcast app, YouTube, or at tellycast.com. We'll be back next week with another show. Until then, stay safe.